.NET Foundation with Peter Ritchie.
The Azure and Devops podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using the latest in .NET, Azure, AI, and DevOps. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. The show is sponsored by ClearMeasure, a full-service software architecture and engineering firm. Find them at www.clearmeasure.com. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. Quick announcement, I am hiring a senior software engineer, and senior does not mean a certain age. I've hired really young ones. It's all about capabilities. And also, December 8th, if you're interested, we just announced another training course. This is all about AI-driven development for .NET. So if you want some in-person, immersive, intensive training in Austin, Texas, December 8th and 9th, you can go to clearmeasure.com and find out all about that. My guest today on the show is Peter Ritchie. He's a veteran software architect and consultant, over 35 years of experience in the tech industry, and he's very renowned for his deep expertise in .NET development, distributed systems, agile methodologies, and the list goes on. He's also an accomplished author of several technical books. He's a former Microsoft MVP and a sought-after international speaker at conferences, and is also actively involved in the .NET community and is a current candidate for the .NET Foundation Board of Directors. And that kind of just shows his commitment to open source and developer advocacy. And through his consulting work, he helps teams elevate their architecture, code quality, and development practices, especially in areas like ASP.NET, clean architecture, and CI/CD pipelines. So, Peter, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
Very good, thanks. Thanks for having me, Jeffrey.
Oh, my pleasure. My pleasure. I like the listeners to kind of get a feel for the background and the level of expert that they're listening to on the show. And so, you've been doing development for longer than I have. What kinds of things keep you interested, keep you engaged, and keep in the deep technical world instead of a shift?
I guess probably the thing that keeps me the most interested is really helping people. I've worked on a lot of things over the years, so just finding something new to work on is kind of tricky, but helping people out working on what they're working on is what I kind of get excited about. Sometimes that help with, team management, if you want to call it that, leadership, or sometimes that gets into, getting into the code with them, pairing with them, giving them some guidance, documentation type guidance, or, example code, or those types of things. So that's kind of where I like to be anyway.
Nice. Yeah. Well, you've seen quite a bit, and, once you figure out the right architecture, it allows quite a few other things to fall into place.
For sure, yeah.
I'd like to start out by asking you about the .NET Foundation, because it's been around for a while, but a lot of people still, .NET developers, they don't know what it is. They don't vote for the board of directors. And so if there's listeners out there that have, they're .NET developers and they've never voted or participated in any way, can kind of give an overview of what it is?
That's a really good question. I don't know if anybody actually knows the answer to that. I think it's evolved quite a bit in the last few years. I think at some level it's kind of an organization that helps bridge the gap between Microsoft and the open source community. Microsoft wants the open source community to thrive, but they also need to have their own, sort of make sure they're covering their own bases with what they're working on and those types of things. So, but I think the foundation helps the community in general work with open source and promotes open source projects and things like that. But I think that's one of the things I would like to see improve a little bit is get better understanding of what the .NET Foundation is, what it's about, what it's for, get more people involved, hopefully more members involved, get them, working on the various things in the foundation, as well as getting the benefits of the foundation. And the benefits might change over time, of course. Hopefully they're a little bit more appealing to the general population, but I think that's, one of the areas I'd like to see improve with the foundation.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I've really enjoyed over the years is just baseline support for Microsoft-related and .NET-related user groups. the Meetup website and StreamYard and various just technical platforms that even if it's just a little bit of money, every organizer and every volunteer would otherwise have to stand up those things. And so just having that support is pretty cool.
For sure, yeah. I think there used to be a lot of good support with something like Ineta back in the day. I don't know if that support is as good as Ineta was back in the day, but hopefully there's some support there for user groups, getting them started, maybe a little bit of funding, but probably a lot of support in that respect.
Yeah. So we've got .NET 10 coming out. The train keeps moving. Visual Studio 2026 Insiders is coming out, and so .NET 9 is almost old news. But just from your perspective, as .NET and Visual Studio keep moving along, what kinds of things get your attention?
I think the stability is what I'm looking. Typically, I work with enterprise clients, so I don't usually use the odd releases like .NET 7 or .NET 9, simply because they want the long-term stability kind of support programs like that. Although that's slightly changing in the future with some of the odd releases. They're extending that support, I think, by 6 months. But yeah, in terms of, what I think is coming out in 10, I think the stability is probably the biggest aspect of that. There's a lot of good features. And of course, coinciding with, Visual Studio 2026, I think we're going to see a lot of good, interesting things happening in the next year or so.
That's a good point that made me think of not just .NET, but pretty much everything that Microsoft does. It's kind of one or the other. They either say, I'm killing the product, or if they keep it around, they are really serious about backwards compatibility. I had a client that came back. I did some IIS2 work with Active Server. No, the technology that preceded Active Server pages, the Internet Database Connector and HTX templates. They preceded Active Server pages 1.0. It was an IIS2, and they came back with an application that I built for them way back then and said, could we do an upgrade? And so we upgraded it to, a few years back to ASP.NET MVC. But that application was still working on, Windows Server 2020, Windows Server 2022 and, all the modern stuff, new versions of, and it was this ancient technology and we were able to update it. So yeah, the stability over time is pretty impressive.
Yeah, that backward support is really, really key to a lot of other things when they support them. Like things like LightSwitch seem to have gone to the wayside, but in general, the stuff they do support, they really do support it. Yeah.
You're right. LightSwitch, it got caught up in the Silverlight browser plugin debacle. Yeah. But there was a mode of LightSwitch that was HTML5 that had nothing to do with LightSwitch. And that got killed as well. And I've been lamenting. It's like, man, that was basically the UI was pretty automatic. You just defined your model and you got an automatic web UI, kind of like people used to love Microsoft Access for a long time ago, this database. And you know what? I think just now with AI driven development, if we're back to, if we can describe our model, we can get a basic UI going on top of that model.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of...
You kind of dove into it.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff in that respect, I think, still. I mean, we've got things like, Open API where you can kind of define what your API looks like, as well as, the bits and pieces of the domain and the domain logic and the basic records, if you want to call them that. And that you can use that to build out various pieces of software and things like that, build out, a CRUD UI type things like that. So, yeah, there's a lot of stuff there that does that. I think one of the things that teams might get burnt on is, trusting that for everything. I mean, you still got to have business logic and that needs to live somewhere. And you can't really define that in an open API spec or, defining your data types and things like that. The behavior and thing needs to be accounted for. And that's usually where things need to happen at some point once you've generated the basic shell of an application.
Yeah. You've seen all the different phases of technology, from waterfall to agile to domain-driven design to all the different phases, and the different ways that the industry has tried to approach business logic and where to put it and how to describe it. When you are starting a new extension to an application or whatnot, what tends to be your approach for how to organize business logic and where to put it and how to think of it?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, I wish there was a really good answer to that, but as an architect, my go-to answer is it depends. But in general, I like to understand things at a high level. I like to separate, kind of the nouns from the verbs, those types of things. Make sure I understand the difference between, what we're going to be dealing with in terms of data, as well as what we're going to be dealing with in terms of behavior, and make sure those things are separate. And then once you build out an architecture, you're going to kind of possibly split up that behavior or that business logic across multiple places. But generally, I try to keep them, if you're doing a microservice type architecture, you probably want to keep that behavior within each of the microservices, but generally keep that behavior in services of that type, whether they're APIs, microservices, applications, those types of things. Keep that application logic or business logic in the application rather than putting it in things like your database and things like that. Now, obviously, you're going to have some sort of behavior in the database with triggers and things and constraints and things, but the meat and potatoes of the domain and the business logic, I like to keep those into the applications of the services around the system that you're designing.
Another question people have to ask, and there's been wild differences over the last decade, is how big to make the version control repository. How big to make the system or parts of the system, and you have words thrown around like monolith and microservices, and now modular monolith. But ultimately, what you end up with is a lot of code in a Git repository or a little bit of code in the Git repository. And young developers are looking at it and like, well, what do I do? And the older developers are like, well, it depends. And so, how do you? How do you think of that?
I would definitely respond with it depends. I mean, it depends on the team structure. It depends on how modular the system is. I mean, if you've got a large system, you're going to have multiple teams, and you're going to follow into that rule where you're going to split things up based on the team, and you're going to have modules based on the team structure, those types of things. So in that case, I would generally gear things around the teams. So maybe a Git repository per team. But I've also worked on teams or in organizations with multiple teams where they've had one, humongous monorepo type thing. I don't think there's any one way that works perfectly. Technically, I think from my aspect, working with multiple repos, I think has been the most successful for me. Just having the contention of people working on code, and if everybody's working in one monorepo, the contention can get high sometimes. But yeah, it depends on how you're organizing it. If you've got one big monolithic UI, then probably a monorepo is probably going to work for you. But if you got multiple pieces, then you might want multiple repos, one for each of those pieces, modules, whatever you're deploying, those types of things.
Yeah. That's, I think you said something really important. You said, I tend to organize it around my teams, because a lot of people might think, oh, that's an architectural decision. I'm going to figure out the shape of the system first. I'm going to figure out the segmenting of it first, and then, chop it up, my thinking of it, and then we'll assign people. Whereas that sounds like, you're flipping on its hand. You're saying, who do we have? How is the organization structured? And let's let that drive some of the architecture decisions.
Yeah, I think if I were given like the perfect situation, like Greenfield, if that sort of thing existed, I'd want to kind of figure out what we needed to solve as an application or system and then build teams around that. But in reality, I don't think I've ever worked in an organization where that were the case. You've always start out with people and teams, organized in groups, teams, if you want to call them that. And then you have to work with that. And sometimes you can build a piece of software around that, or sometimes you might need to reorganize the teams. But generally, I find that you start out with a set of teams or a set of group of people that you have to work with. And those teams usually have existed before and they work well together. So you don't necessarily want to break up the team and organize people based on the structure of the software. So I find it, oddly, it gets back to it depends, but typically you're working with the teams and organizing around the teams that already exist.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's very different if you've got an existing steady state department of developers and technical specialists versus, say, a RFP style contract where no organization exists and now some big amount of money is going to be commissioned to develop some big system and everybody's going to be new. Yeah, love it. Well, let me ask you about testing. That's another topic that's had a lot of debate over 25 years.
Easily,
now, right inside Visual Studio, there's a test runner in pretty much every IDE, which didn't always used to be the case, but now it
That's
is.
true.
But still there's debate on, okay, well, what is a unit test? What's not a unit test? What are the other types of tests? What should we call them? Where should we run them? What's a part of continuous integration and what's not? But so generally, without special situations, what tends to be your habit around tests and how to organize them?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a fairly technical person. Usually get involved in the code at some point, so I kind of focus on the unit tests, or I generally call them automated tests. You could get really pedantic about what a unit is and what it isn't, and what an integration test and what that isn't. But I generally just kind of focus on automated testing. And if something is something that I can do quickly in a unit test, within a second or, several milliseconds, then I would just do it. It doesn't matter if it's an integration test or a unit test. I would just put it in there and run it, do that with my automated testing and things like that. If there's some automated tests that I find that are getting a little bit lengthy, I might, classify them as an integration test, and maybe those don't get run at certain times. Like maybe there's a nightly build and we run all the tests, including integration tests, or if we're doing a check-in or doing a PR, then maybe we're going to run only certain tests and not do the integration tests. But definitely at some point, I'd be looking at running those tests in the pipeline while we're doing a PR, and that would be included in what I would expect to see when I'm doing a PR on somebody's code. I want to see those unit tests. I want to see what's passed and what's failed. If I see anything has failed, I'm probably not even going to look at the PR, but definitely want to see the unit tests and what they're covering and the degree of coverage on them.
Yeah. You said something that I think is really interesting. You mentioned reviewing PRs. Now, with your experience level, pretty much everybody on your team is junior to you because you've been, 35 years of experience. And so that puts you in the position of reviewing work of others. Whereas the really young engineers listening to this podcast, they probably don't review anybody else's work. They're the ones who are creating work and then getting comments back and like, what you want me? Well, why do I need to change that? And I don't understand. So yeah, it seems like a natural progression as you get more experience. Okay, you're going to be reviewing the work of others. That's just the way it goes. Yeah. Early in my career, I remember telling a colleague who had probably 15 years of experience on top of me when I was 6 or 7 years into programming, and I said, "Man, this is so much fun. I never want to supervise anybody. I never want to be a manager. I just want to sit here and code all day. I'm happy with my hands on the keyboard." And I just didn't have the perspective that there's so much more to do in software.
Yeah, sometimes I kind of view it as meta-programming when you're actually kind of programming the programmers, where you're mentoring them or guiding them and getting them into, using things like patterns and things, especially with some of the junior folks. I mean, it's one thing to write good software. It's another to write around patterns and have it more understandable. I find it, in today's atmosphere, you want to have code that's, understandable and maintainable over time, not just, performant and works, whatever works for today. It's got to work in the future, and it's got to be able to evolve over time, because that's the only thing we can really be sure of is things are going to change in the next few days, if not few hours some days.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I want to make sure we plug, before we wrap up the show, make sure we plug your blog and whatnot. You've got a blog on peterritchie.com or blog.peterritchie.com, and we'll include a link to that in the show notes. You're a pretty active blogger, pretty consistent. The blogging trend, some people like myself did some blogging and whatnot, and then we kind of fallen off. But you had an interesting about a week ago blog called "Being a Successful Software Developer: Inspiration for Clear Expectations." And you were talking about defining user stories and of course in Agile, the common parlance of breaking things down from epic to feature to user story, and having absolute clarity on what is in and what is out. And I remember some conversations in the Agile community, and even some of the tools like Jira and Azure boards, where a lot of time you can just put in a title and then boom, now I've got a ticket or a backlog item or whatever, an issue. And then, it gets tossed over to developers and say, go work on it. Ask questions if you have any. Whereas Whereas, your blog caused me to think, there's some standard things that have to be defined. Otherwise, we're just reliably missing information. How do you tend to coach people on what the absolute basics of definitions should be?
Yeah, I think at some degree it depends, but I mean, getting into some of those key aspects of what we know about in terms of agile development now, like Gherkin format and those types of things, where we've got a user story where we're talking about a role, we're talking about an action that they need to provide, or that we need to provide to them, or they want to perform, as well as some sort of, criteria about, or not necessarily criteria, but what benefit they want to get out of that particular piece of functionality that they want to get out of it. And that I think is a bare minimum, but that's usually not enough for us as developers to actually implement something that's going to be acceptable to them. So we need to kind of dig into that, and that's where Gherkin kind of comes in or aids us in documenting that and understanding what the criteria is around those. And generally we want to look at things that are kind of measurable. One way to look at that is, kind of the quality attributes or non-functional attributes or non-functional stuff that we want to put into that particular piece of functionality, and look at, things that we can measure like performance or reliability and those types of things. Those are the types of things I try to mentor people in. It's like, you can accept what the user story says at face value, but you can also ask questions about it and ask questions about those things like that. Often I do kind of similar to 5 whys. I don't think anybody actually does the 5 whys and keeps asking why until somebody gets annoyed.
Mm-hmm.
But definitely ask why. Somebody gives me a user feature that they want to do something. I want to have this action or get this benefit out of it. I'm going to ask, well, what are you trying to get out of that? What are you trying to achieve? Or why do you want to do that? And that leads to larger conversations about, the answer to that type of thing. And that really, for me, really kind of digs into what they're actually trying to accomplish. So one of the things I find with, especially with product owners and the people who want to have that type of functionality is, they make assumptions about what they think they need, and they try to sometimes solution things. But if we start asking those questions, we can get at the root of what they're trying to get to, and we get around some of those assumptions or some of the things they forgot to mention. And that's usually, what I try to get into in terms of helping people understand what they're trying to provide to their users.
That's a good point. In your blog post, you even go into clarity on the goal of the project, organizational vision, the mission of the organization, the values, the scope of the project. And it kind of reminds me of what GitHub Copilot needs. If you just say, here's a little blurb for a feature, reliably, it's going to give you code that you're not going to be happy with. Mm-hmm. You have to kind of build up this foundation of knowledge that gives this artificial neural network brain the full context of what kind of code is going to hit the mark. And we as people, we have the genuine intelligence, the real neural network brain. And in order for us to figure out, okay, what code should I write? Those are the foundational layers of understanding to be able to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we're seeing that in all of the AI stuff like Claude. I think one of the things we saw early on with AI is ask those silly questions with, a user story without criteria or without the Gherkin format, and AI would generate something that wasn't useful to anybody, or it worked in very small circumstances. But once you add that context around it, the various layers of context, like the project context, the team context, organizational context, all those things feed into what you actually want to get out of it. And I'm hoping if we get anything out of this AI revolution, it's that we need to have all those layers of context, not just with AI, but with the people we work with in order to get the quality out of what we want to get out of our software.
So we're going to figure out how to properly use a fake computer brain, and then we're going to realize, wait a minute, what if we applied that learning to interacting with people that have the real brains? What would happen then?
Exactly. I think that would be the ultimate irony, that we go through this exercise of trying to get AI to do things and realize that if we just tell ourselves the things that we're trying to tell AI, we could probably do it faster and probably more reliably.
Yeah. I think you're right. Because, we still have no idea why the brain works the way it does. We just look at it and say, wait a minute, this looks like this network of these things, we'll call them neurons, and it looks like they link together, and we just figure out how to pattern match along through life. And just, we have some stimulus and it causes us to immediately associate it with something that we've seen in the past. What if we built a machine that kind of had that structure? And again, you listen to the lectures to the early AI researchers, and they still don't even know why it works. They just said, well, we just built something that kind of looked like we saw the brain working, and turns out it does some really good pattern matching. I still don't know why it does it, but it kind of does it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's what it's doing. It's what we've got with the large language models is something that can understand what the answer to a question should look like based on the information it's been taught, which, at some aspect, that's great. You want to have the answer to the question if it exists, but if the answer never existed, you're not going to get an answer out of them. You're going to get hallucinations and things like that, where it tries to make things up. But it's also been trained on everything all over the world. So it's been trained on bad code as well as good code, but it doesn't know the difference between bad code, good code. So it's going to give you, what is statistically the most probable in the answer. So if it's been trained on a lot of bad code, you're probably going to get an answer that involves a lot of bad code too.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, as we kind of wrap up, we'll include links to your websites on the show, and how can people find you? Any speaking engagements or anything coming up that we should put the word out on?
I just finished up a speaking engagement in Winnipeg a couple weeks ago, so I don't have anything planned at the moment. So basically just going to the blog is where everything's happening for me.
All right. We'll include blog.peterritchie.com. So, well, Peter, thanks for coming on the show and having a chat with me. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been a great chat.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure and DevOps podcast. You can find us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and anywhere you get your podcasts. Visit our sponsor, ClearMeasure, at www.clearmeasure.com. And on behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.